Well, hey guys, hope you're doing well. We are on chapter 27 of Living by the Book, and we're actually now starting the section of interpretation, the second step in the Bible study method or inductive Bible study. So we looked at 26 chapters of interpretation, of observation, and that's foundational. That's incredibly important because if your observation is off, then your interpretation is going to be off. So we looked at observation. Now we jump to interpretation, right? What does it mean? And so Hendricks talks about the value of interpretation, and it's kind of like Philip, right? He was called to the Ethiopian eunuch in order to help him explain the portion of scripture that he had, right? And so the Ethiopian eunuch, he read the scripture, but he wanted to know, well, what does this mean? He wanted to know, he understood what it said, but he wanted to go deeper. He wanted to know, well, what does it mean? And then he responded to it. Remember that? Interpretation is incredibly important. And 2 Timothy 3:16 says that all scripture is profitable. That means it has purpose, it has meaning. God doesn't try to give us a puzzle to try to understand. He doesn't make it difficult for us. He wants us to read it and understand it. And but unfortunately, many people today they've decided that the law of logic doesn't apply when it comes to scripture. Right? To them, it doesn't matter whether you see the text as I see the text. It's like, well, interpret it however you want. No, that's not how it works. Right? You observe it factually, and then you interpret it to see what it means in the context. Interpretation, he says, is like a recreation process. And what does it mean? So that's what we're on right now, and this is so important, incredibly important. Interpretation is where we develop a superstructure, and in observation we excavate. In interpretation, we build. And in order to build, you want to make sure that, again, the foundation is solid, it's strong. Observation is the foundation, and then the construction of the building is interpretation, right? The quality of your interpretation will always depend on the quality of your observation. So why interpretation? Why must we interpret? Why should we interpret scripture? Well, the answer is that time and distance have thrown up. Let me just tell you, there's a few barriers when it comes to interpretation that we have to think about. I'm just going to list them and kind of briefly talk about them for you guys. Number one, there's language barriers. Two, there's cultural barriers. There's literary barriers. There's communication barriers. And there's also the barrier of totally interpreting things wrong, like faulty interpretations. So, language barriers. We have to learn really the mindset and the culture and worldview and how they saw things back in the day. There's language barriers, what things meant, what words meant. That's why a lot of sermons have a lot of defining to do, right? Because they're defining what these things mean. So the process of interpretation involves the use of a Bible dictionary, or it should, right? Because it gives us the cultural context, the language barriers, or different ways and definitions of what things meant. And the second is cultural barrier. He says the Bible is the product and presentation of culture that are dramatically different from our own and different from each other. And so you really have to, in a sense, reconstruct the cultural barriers in the context of communication and transportation, trade, agriculture, occupation, regions, perception of time, and so on. Number three, literary barriers. He says the problem we run into interpreting scriptures is the variety of terrain, right? He says, but the literary genres of the Bible are quite diverse and demand vastly different approaches. Like he uses an example, Song of Solomon, you don't use the same cold logic as you would for the book of Romans, right? It's very logical, very straightforward, very direct. You don't use that same cold logic when you look into Song of Solomon because it's more poetic, Song of Solomon, right? So it matters what you're reading. So there's literary barriers. And then there's communication barriers as well. We must contend with breakdowns in the communication process. And here's the thing, is it possible to interpret the Bible? Well, yes, of course. But we need to know that we're always going to encounter problems. And basically, Hendricks says that he's like, some students, because he's worked at a theological seminary and everything, and some students ask, I can't believe you don't understand everything in the Bible. And Hendricks is like, well, how can you expect for a finite being to understand an infinite God 100% of everything? If that were the case, then that finite being would not need an infinite God. So no, there are certain things we don't know. We're never going to know this side of heaven, and that's okay, right? But we can understand a lot as we interpret, as we observe the scripture, what we're reading, and then interpret it. Observe it, what does it say? Interpret it, what does it mean? And so this is chapter 27, guys, the value of interpretation. And in chapter 28, he's basically going to talk about the faulty interpretation, right? And he's going to really delve into that a little bit. And that's an important thing, because we don't want to have faulty interpretation. We want to interpret things based on observation and do that literally, right? So he's going to talk about that in the next chapter. But again, we're starting interpretation. This is exciting. Thank you guys who are following along with me. If you have any questions, message me through Facebook, or even put something down in the comments. And God bless you guys. Hope you have a good day, and we'll talk to you next time.